challenges. Because we can process decisions and have lines of reason for the things that we do, and yet we have this gnawing internal process where we hear ourselves talking to ourselves, or we hear voices. Maybe it's a voice of temptation and we think the devil's talking to us. Or maybe it's a voice to be obedient to biblical commands and we think at that moment God is talking to us. What's going on inside this cranium and all that is possessed there? And we'll talk next week about the spirit. So the role of conscience. Some of the we're going to talk about stereotypes. We'll get a biblical overview of the domain of conscience, and we'll also have some conclusions. Not all these slides are in your notes, but we will be in the notes in a moment, and I'll alert you. Stereotypes of conscience. Some think that conscience is an audience room for the direct communication of God or the devil. I have a sticker on my banjo case. It says, "I just do what the little voices tell me to do." You know? And of course, that's one of the traits of insanity. Every mass murderer has done what the little voices tell that person to do. Is conscience an audience room? Are these voices, I once was doing a seminar and a young lady was very resistant because she said, "I've been driving to work for 5 years and I've never had an accident. And the reason I've never had an accident, because every time I come to a stop sign, I wait for God to tell me which way to go to work." And she said, "I've never had an accident because," you see, well, correlation is not exactly causation. You have to be, we can make assertions, but are they appropriate assertions? No, I don't think so. So is it an audience room? I don't think the conscience is an audience room. Now, there's pieces of conviction about the Spirit that we'll talk about next week that are indescribable. And yet at the same time, I think that by and large, it is ourself talking to ourself. Thinking from the standpoint of our values, where we're on target and where we are violating those. Furthermore, conscience is a created capacity for self-reflection. It is a very important function in human beings. And it's in all human beings, in every culture. And Romans, as we'll see, tells us that listening to conscience keeps our culture from going absolutely crazy. It keeps us to some values and order in society. It's a God-created capacity for self-reflection. It's not self-reflection in and of itself, but it's a part of that self-reflection. It's ourselves talking to ourselves. Internal values speech is what's going on inside of the conscience. And we'll unpack that in a moment. Now, the domain of conscience. It's internal, critical, self-awareness, an internal witness. This word witness becomes very important. In fact, the interesting thing is in the biblical text, the word witness is the key word for conscience, and the word witness is the key word for the Spirit. And these are both internal pieces to us as human beings. Uses the same word for both, and we'll see this in the text and as we move along. But in our little stick person again, conscience is in the mind. Data goes in. It's run through, and in this internal processing, we have a worldview and we have values. And it's like conscience is the eyes inside the mind to manage the data that comes in and evaluate it in light of our worldview and values. And the pain that we feel when we have a bad thought, when we're tempted to lust, or we're tempted to lie, or we're tempted to cheat, when we feel a tinge of pain, don't we? Why? Because we are violating our values, and conscience's role is to remind us of that. But we're going to see that Paul was persecuting and killing Christians, other human beings, and never felt bad about it before his conversion. Why? Because his values said, put the Christians down because they're threatening the Jewish religion. In our own world today, we see with terrorism, those who are driven by supposed religious principles, and even their own say they're not appropriate, but that won't make any difference. Just like fundamentalism in the western mountains of North Carolina that still handles snakes and drinks poison. There's still rattlesnake services in some isolated regions of western Carolina. On misunderstanding some of the issues out of the end of Mark. And you're not going to convince them, because not to do what they are convicted to do is backsliding. And fighting a religious person is the hardest thing in the world to do. It's better to fight an atheist. At least you know they might give up. This is not going to go away anytime soon, is it? I don't know that it will ever go away. And how is the world going to manage this new era? Or will it be God's sovereignty in the ushering in of the end times? And by the way, the end times have been ever since the apostles, the last days. So don't be looking for signs, because if you see them, it's too late. You got missed in the process somehow. Okay? There's a lot of issues there. That's not our class. All right? And then meaning comes out on the other side. All right? We've talked about that a lot. Now let's think about 3 characteristics of conscience. Conscience is a capacity. This is part of your notes, I believe. It's a God-given capacity for self-critique. These are going to be the points in the prose notes that I've given you. And so we'll see these in a moment from the pages. Secondly, conscience is a witness to the worldview and value system we recognize and apply. That's what holds us to what we believe. Internal thinking process. It's also a monitor. It is not an originator of our thoughts. Conscience is not a judge. It's a witness. A witness cannot do anything but tell what it saw or heard. In a court of law, that's very strict. No circumstantial evidence. And the conscience is not a judge. It does not originate information and opinions. It monitors the worldview and the value system that exist internal to us. And it is a servant of that worldview and values. That's why Paul could feel good killing Christians. It was noble for him to do so. Because that was his worldview and values. But after conversion, that all changed. Why? Because he had a different mind of things. There was a transformation of the way he thought about it when he understood that Jesus is the Messiah. And it took him in a very different direction. We'll talk about this specifically. Now, let's look at your notes where it says introduction, conscience and decision making. We've talked a lot about Romans 12, 1 and 2, the transformed mind. And I think we need to have that constantly in the front of our thinking, that all this is taking place. Data's coming in. We're processing it, kicking it out. And conscience is a term we hear and use frequently. But most people think of conscience a little more like that Almond Joy candy bar again. It's kind of indescribably delicious. Just what is that thing inside of my head? An interesting history of conscience is there's no Hebrew term, technically, for conscience. The word heart in the Old Testament is a term that's used to provide the same thing that conscience provides. Even in the Greek Bible that translated the Hebrew Bible, there's only about 2 places where they use the Greek word for conscience. Now, there's a lot of issues about why that might be, but I can't digress into it. There may be because it's holistic. The ancient Hebrews did not bifurcate a human being. We are one person, one whole person, and so the Greeks tended to kind of compartmentalize things a little more. But it is interesting that the Greek Bible resisted or never even thought to use the word conscience because it wasn't appropriate. There's a couple of places, and I'll illustrate to you something in a moment about it. Well, I'll do it right now. Ecclesiastes 10:20 is a place that's quite fascinating. And just listen to it. Actually, I want to read it. Ecclesiastes 10:20 is one of the only 2 places where this comes into view. Sitting kind of hiding there right after the song, right after Proverbs. Ecclesiastes 10:20. Now listen to this. And interestingly, it's in poetry at this point. Do not curse the king, even in your thoughts, in the internal peace of you. That's where the word is. See, do not curse the king in your thoughts. You see, the word conscience comes out of the words for knowledge. It's derived from that linguistic database. And so thoughts fits very well. Or curse the rich, even in your what? In your bedroom. Now what's the point? The point is, what is the most private place in your entire life? Your head and your bedroom. Those are the most private, protected areas of life. You feel violated when they leave the microphone on and you shouldn't have said anything. That's cute. They ought to learn that by now. How many times does that happen? Maybe if they were more consistent. And the bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice. In other words, what you're thinking or saying in the privatest parts of your life. Or some winged creature tell the matter. And the point is, if it gets out, you're going to suffer. You see, this image is what little bit they had, that there's a private internal piece of us that, if it's known, can cause pain. Many think that the conscience's role is to create pain in our rational process, and that it doesn't have a positive side. I'm not of that opinion. I think it does both negative and positive, but it's very clear that the history of this word and its usage is more of a negative thing. That's a negative verse that we just read. If you let a secret out, it will bring you pain. And conscience causes pain as we battle with our values and our worldview and how we deal with people. That's what's going on inside of us. So it's really a New Testament term. The New Testament pattern has 27 usages of the word conscience. 22 of them are in Paul, and if there's 5 in Hebrews in addition to that, there's only 3 times in Peter. It's almost exclusively a Pauline term. And its major usage got started in the book of Corinthians, where Paul was probably dealing with certain issues with the Corinthians that the Greek concept of conscience was involved with. So it's a fascinating piece. Conscience comes from a verb to know. Its oldest usage merely means to know or to be aware or to share knowledge, even sometimes secretive. It's got that secretive piece. And of course, our conscience is very much of a secret to us, isn't it? We don't share all the times we feel pain. And sometimes we don't respond to it when we should. That's the role of conscience. Now, what I'm going to do is the reverse of research. I'm going to give you an extended definition of conscience, which comes at the end of a lot of work. And then I'm going to give you some highlights of how that came into being. Here's the definition in your notes. Conscience is a critical inner awareness, a witness, and you'll notice how I've underlined that. A witness in reference to the norms and values which we recognize and apply. That is what conscience does. So if your norms and values are wrong, you won't feel pain. Sometimes you feel pain when you shouldn't, because you're not wrong, but you've maybe been in a certain kind of Christian culture that told you something was wrong, and you've adopted that view. Let me give you an illustration of that. when I was, I'm having some deja vu here a little bit because I've just been in Miami and did 9 hours of this. But I'm sure I didn't talk to you about this. I hope I didn't use this illustration. But when I was in high school, I loved to hang out with my uncles because my uncles were cool. They drank beer, smoked cigarettes, and played pool all day. I thought that was cool. One morning I went to school, high school, and some of my friends, we were talking about skipping school that day, going down to 5th Street in this little factory town, play pool. Unknown to us, there was a teacher behind the wall that heard us. And I said, no, I can't do that. And then I went and did it anyway. He called my mom and congratulated her for having a son who didn't skip school and pushed against his peers. When I got home, she said, so-and-so called. I thought I was toast. And then she said what he said. Oh, yeah, I am good. You know? Okay. Well, anyway, you know, billiard balls have a certain sound, don't they? That's distinct. Well, I became a Christian while I was in the Navy on my way from San Diego to New London, Connecticut on a Greyhound bus. I stopped in my hometown for a little while and accepted Christ, and I won't give all the information right now, I don't have time, and then continued the bus up into Connecticut. 3 days on a Greyhound to get across the U.S. Non-stop except for my home piece. Well, anyway, so I got to New London, Connecticut, and I was told I was just a fresh Christian, and I was encouraged to find a Christian Serviceman Center where I could learn the Bible. Well, I located one in Groton, Connecticut, and I went across the river from New London, and I saw the sign, and I'm going to Camelot. And I walk up the stairs, I get halfway up, and I hear the breaking of billiard balls. And I said to myself, this cannot be a Christian Serviceman Center. Because the only thing I knew about pool was 5th Street, the Black Cat, and the Mecca, and my uncles. And that wasn't Christian. I knew that. Well, I went back down, checked the sign. I said, geez, this is the place. I walked upstairs, and a friendly fellow greeted me, and I looked to my right, and there were 3 pool tables with servicemen playing pool, and they were being served sandwiches and refreshments. It was an evangelistic kind of a place. But I felt very uncomfortable. I moved away from those tables. I thought these people couldn't be what they claimed to be. And it took me a long, long time to work through that. Why? Because my worldview and values had a certain view of that phenomena. And attached to a certain place. Guilt by association was rampant here. But as I grew, I came to understand it's not the billiards, it's where they are. It's who's doing it. And it was probably a few years before I felt comfortable picking up a pool stick and playing pool. Well, that's the issue of worldviews and values and conscience. You see, conscience in this sense is not your guide. Your worldview and your values are. You have to re-educate, and that's what the transformed mind is about. You have to re-educate your worldview and values, and sometimes it takes conscience a little while to come along, just like those Christians in Corinthians and Romans who were having a problem with meat sacrificed to idols. If we had the time, I could show you in 1 Corinthians that when it says, ask no questions for conscience sake. Remember, that's the way the King James phrases it. A lot of our stereotypes are out of that language. If you see new translations, it won't translate it the same way. Ask no questions for conscience sake. For many years, I thought that meant what you don't know won't hurt you. Can you imagine the Apostle Paul teaching that? No. What it means is ask no questions for conscience, because conscience doesn't matter. Worldview and values matters. Conscience has to be adjusted to that. And so that's what I mean by the fact that conscience is a servant. Now let me show you something here. We'll finish the definition. The next sentence, it does not create norms and values. Conscience is not a judge. It's not a creator. It's a witness. It's a monitor. It does not create norms and value, but merely responds to our existing software. That's a nice analogy these days. Conscience must be educated, programmed in relation to a critically developed world and life view. This development for the Christian is rooted in special revelation of the Bible. I've known a lot of Christians who have acted very wickedly and thought they were serving God in denominational controversies, in educational institutions where prima donnas wanted to get other people out because they didn't agree with the way they did it. I've seen this. I was ordained in 1967, and so I've been watching this stuff for a while, and it's not pretty sometimes. But and I've sat down in offices with intelligent, educated, ministerial people who were adamant about certain things and felt like they had the divine view on it. And now they're going to destroy other people for God. You see, if your values are skewed, if your values are skewed, your judgments will be skewed. And conscience will support it. So conscience is an interesting critter inside of us. But it is a part of our self-reflection. Now let's think about these three characteristics of conscience in relation to Christian decision-making. First, conscience is a capacity for self-critique. It's an aspect of our internal processing. It should not be personified into an aspect independent of the person. It's not an external voice of some kind, either of God or of the devil. Self-reflection is ourselves talking to ourselves, and conscience interfaces with that inner discussion to check if it is in line with what we recognize, the values and norms that we recognize and apply. Now let me show you a fascinating passage, 1 Corinthians 4:4, that I have up on the screen. Paul says, and I can't rebuild that whole context now, but he says to the Corinthians who were really pushing back on him and were resisting him. And it's in chapter 4 where he presents the motto of ministry. And he says, I am not aware of anything against myself at the left column, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. When he says in an NRSV or a King James Version, those formal translations, I am not aware of anything against myself, he's using the Greek verb for conscience. Now look how the NIV translates it, which is a dynamic interpretive translation, and I think it nails what's going on here. My conscience is clear. In other words, when I stop and do an internal audit, nothing bothers me. My conscience is clear. And then look at the next phrase. But that does not make me innocent. What a fascinating statement. So if someone walks into my office and shares with me a decision that I have some questions about, and they justify the decision on the basis that their conscience is clear, am I going to accept that and not have any questions? No. Because that is not a proof. It's a conviction. It's the way they feel about it, but it's not a proof. Your worldview and values have to be evaluated to see if that is appropriate. Conscience, in that sense, is not in and of itself an authority. And yet, I think we live a lot of our lives thinking that it is. But what does it do? It just confirms us. And sometimes it confirms us wrongly. So if your conscience is clear, it may be because your values are bad. And so we've got to look at something that's more foundational. Here's another interesting passage, if you'd turn in your Bibles to Romans 2:14 and 15. As we think about this capacity for self-critique. Romans 2:14 and 15. I think this is another text that sometimes gets misread. But it's a fascinating text when we read it in its context. In the first part of Romans, Paul is showing how both Jews and Gentiles are sinners before God, in need of justification, salvation. 2:12. All have sinned apart from the law, will also perish apart from the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified. Justified there is functional, not forensic. Okay? 14. When Gentiles, now he's speaking to Jews back in the early part of chapter 2. But watch what he does now. When Gentiles who do not possess the law, and the Jews were very proud that they possessed the law, do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They do not have the commandment that says, thou shalt not kill. But if you find a group of natives that have never had any outside influence at all, and they have a value that thou shalt not kill, they have developed that value as human beings in certain ways because they didn't have the law to tell them that value, but they are doing what? They're obeying that value. Now watch what he does with that. Verse 15. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own what? Conscience bears witness. What he's really saying in this argument is this. You Jews have the law and you blow it. Gentiles don't even have it, but they act better than you do. Because what rules they do have, they pay attention to. They live up to their standards and their values. Man, that's a nasty condemnation, especially in the context of Jewish pride about the law. A capacity. Even those who have no biblical material have a capacity to live up to the values that their culture has instilled. Right or wrong, but in this case, the illustration is positive. And yet, we who have Scripture find ways to dance around things all the time. You know? It's a dangerous thing, isn't it? There's lots of other texts about the capacity. So we have the capacity for this decision-making process and to be sensitive and listen to, but we need to understand how that conscience works. There's a second piece when we look at all of these passages, not many of them, but all of this is the product of looking at these 27 texts. The second thing is that conscience is a witness to the worldview and value system we recognize and apply. Number 2 in your notes. Passages which describe conscience under the picture of a witness. And here again, let's get the imagery, because witness is a metaphor. It's a figure of speech to try to communicate an idea to us about how this operates. A witness does not create evidence, but is bound to respond to the evidence which exists. We just read Romans 2:15 in that regard for one text, but we'll look, just you don't have to turn, don't need to make a Bible drill, but Romans 9:1. It's another text. I am speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience confirms it. In other words, my self-evaluative processing confirms it. And he even adds that the Holy Spirit's also a part of that process. So you see, it's fascinating how conscience and spirit are part of the same internal process. I don't know, frankly, how we can sometimes separate them. If the conviction is correct. What difference does it make anyway, if the conviction is correct? There's no reason to have to worry about that. They're both serving the same kind of internal purpose of self-evaluation. So, conscience is a witness to the worldview and value system which we recognize and apply. It's in this particular category where we have a lot of text on the next page, where the word clear. I have a clear conscience. I have a good conscience. Look at all those passages. That's part of the witnessing process. But that witnessing process is predicated upon a pre-understanding of what is right and what is wrong and what is biblical and what is not within the apostles' teaching. 1 Corinthians 8:7-13 is a fascinating text, and it correlates a little with Romans. Many scholars do not think that the context of Corinthians and Romans about the meat offered to idols is exactly the same historical situation. That's a long story. But there are some very interesting similarities. In Romans 14, where you have the weak and the strong, it never uses the word conscience, it uses the word faith. They're weak in faith. In Corinthians, it doesn't use the word faith, but it uses the word conscience. They're weak in conscience. Weak in regard to being able to process and live up to the truth that they know. Look at 1 Corinthians 8 just for a moment. 7 to 13. Should have put these on slides, I suppose. But it's good to look at your own Bible. It is not everyone, however, 8, 7 to 13, who has this what? Knowledge. This weak and strong issue is dealt with along the lines of knowing. The strong have knowledge, but they're using it as a crowbar. The weak don't have knowledge. Now listen, this stuff was read publicly. Would you feel very good when you heard this if you were in that weak category? No. It's not flattering to either one of them, frankly. But let me say this, and listen to me very carefully. Paul is saying that the strong are right and the weak are wrong about their worldview. And yet, on the basis of love, he's asking the strong not to destroy the weak until what? They've had a time to process and change their mind. In my book, I make this comment. How long do you put up with the weak? That's always a question, isn't it? Well, first of all, in any congregation, you're always going to have the process, aren't you? Because you got new people coming and going. But how long do you put up with the weak that you've been working with? The answer is simple, really. You put up with them until they have had a reasonable opportunity to come to a correct view. If they refuse to do that, they're no longer weak, they're belligerent. And there are different rules of engagement. So we are not at the eternal mercy of the weak because they're wrong. And that's clear in these passages. But at the same time, 70 times 7. Since some have become so accustomed to idols until now, they still think of the food they eat as food offered to an idol, and their conscience. In other words, and you have to be careful how you read this. Their values have told them that it's an idol. Their worldview is worried about that. Their conscience makes them feel pain if they get guilt by association with this meat. Being weak is defiled. It says the conscience is weak. It doesn't say the knowledge. It's the conscience. Their knowledge is flat wrong. Nothing weak about it. Food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this liberty of yours, that is the strong, does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Paul is just as honest as the day is long. Some are right, some are wrong, but you can be right and wrong at the same time if you use your power of knowledge in the wrong way. But what we really need to realize is that he's teaching what's right. You don't give up on knowing what is right, even if you choose to suspend your rights, as it were, to use the word in a different way. Fascinating stuff in this passage, if we'd read it carefully. There's a third thing about conscience. When we look at these texts, conscience is a monitor, not an originator of our thoughts. It's a servant of our worldview and values. I've stated it in notes a little fuller. Conscience is a monitor of our thinking in relation to decision making. It does not provide the reason for decisions. I'm doing it because my conscience is clear. That's not a biblical statement. Now, if your conscience is clear, the next step is to ask, is it right? Is it a good value? Is it part of our worldview that's appropriate? Conscience does not provide the reason for decisions, but red and green lights. The green light would be the positive side in relation to decisions. And of course, like I said, many do not think that conscience really is a green light. It's only a red light. That's a very difficult issue. But it's a servant of our value system. Again, 1 Corinthians, look at chapter 10 just for a moment. This is a fascinating piece. I just want you to see this. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 23. All things are lawful. By the way, that's what the Corinthians were saying. That's a slogan. That's not what Paul said. But Paul responded, but not all things are beneficial. They said, all things are lawful. Then Paul said, but not all things build up. See, in Corinthians, one of the very interesting pieces is Paul is responding to the statements they're making and dealing with those statements. Like in 1 Corinthians 7:1. In the old King Jimmy it says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Paul didn't say that. The NIV translated, it's good for a man not to marry, which is a horrible translation. It's been criticized up and down, and the new NIV is probably going to change that because the TNIV did, even though they've junked the TNIV and now they got a new NIV. Okay? But I'll guarantee you they probably don't translate that the way they did, because to say it's good for a man not to marry skews the whole context of that chapter in the wrong direction. Because that's the chapter in which Paul says that spirituality doesn't trump marriage. And that takes some explanation. I'll just tease you with that one. I have the guilt of aggravation. I have the gift of aggravation. Guilty, that's a Freudian slip there? Okay. Verse 24. Do not seek your own advantage, but that of the other. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without, and here's where that phrase comes in, without asking questions for conscience sake. That's the way the King James rendered it. But the NIV or the NRSV says, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. You see, because conscience is not a grounds. It's not an issue of conscience. It's an issue of worldview. You read that text from that perspective, and it'll open up a whole new way of thinking about what's going on there. So conscience is not able to judge the right or wrong of your values. It's merely a servant to them. So consequently, as Christians, we've got to be critical thinkers so that we can question what we think, and when we claim that our conscience is clear, on the basis of our values. Some conclusions. I might even have those in this thing. True or false? Let conscience be your guide. No. However, one caution. Conscience is a God-created mechanism. You can't kick it out. You got to listen. You got to do that internal processing. It would be a dangerous thing not to allow conscience to do its work. But it is not the judge. It's merely the witness. You have got to come back and study the case law to decide whether it's right or wrong. Conscience can only witness to what exists. It's not a lawgiver. And I think that's a major problem with some thinking about conscience. Conscience is the internal voice of self-reflection. It is not an open audience room for the demons and the devil and even God. Conscience goes as the values go. Now, look at the notes. Conscience is an aspect of our self-reflective ability. It's an aspect of self-awareness which produces the pain or pleasure we feel as we reflect upon the norms and the values which we recognize and apply. It's not a rival ontological unit in the inner person. This is another mistake. We talk about the old nature, the new nature, like we're schizophrenic. We're one person with old characteristics and new characteristics, and it's our decision-making process to respond to the new and put down the old. We die. All the metaphors that are used, crucified with Christ, a spiritual sacrifice, die, put to death, and so forth, are all talking about putting down the bad characteristics, the works of the flesh, and those kinds of lists. It's our ability as humans to critique ourselves. It's an aspect of our humanness which God has created to provide moral restraint within His creation. It's very important. It brings us back to our values. But if our values are wrong, so are our actions, and we could have a clear conscience and be wrong. Therefore, it's not an end in itself. It's not a lawgiver, as I've said repeatedly. It's a guide which must be critiqued by the judge, that is God, and from our standpoint, the Scriptures. Subjective voices constitute ourselves talking to ourselves. These voices must be critiqued by God's Word. There is no process by which we discern the future. So if you hear a voice, that's not an authority. It could be a wake-up call, because it is yourself talking to yourself, and God can use that. In fact, He stimulates it by creating you to be able to do that. And it may very well be that this internal process of the Spirit that we cannot put in a test tube does what conscience is doing too. And it's not our job to decide which one's doing it at any given time. It's our job to respond to the conviction and ask, is it right, is it wrong? Are we going in the right direction or the wrong direction? Are we willing to think about what it is we're bothered by? But being bothered is not the end of the day. Consequently, the role of conscience in discerning God's will is to perform an internal process of witnessing to our norms and values. The accuracy of its witness depends on the validity of our norms and values, and those have to be determined by a thorough, objective study of Scripture. And they will also fall in those three categories we talked about: biblical commands, community values, and personal convictions. And we need to know which of the categories we might be in at any given time. Thanks for your attention this evening. Have a good week, and next week will be our last session on the Spirit.